Do you remember 5 to 10 years ago when people said Adelaide's a dud and it's just not going to grow? Or even the same thing about Perth or Brisbane, and yet they provided the largest gains in recent years. As the wise Warren Buffett says, when investing, the rearview mirror is always clearer than the windshield. But we can still learn from what's happened to get a better understanding of what potentially is happening. In this episode, I'm going to clean the windshield and help you understand why poor growth doesn't necessarily mean no growth into the future. What market changes to look out for, and how almost every single place in Australia has its time. You just need to understand the numbers to tell you why and when. I'm Arjun Paliwal, let's get into it. So the key thing to just take out of what I said was that every single city has its time in the sun. And the problem with property data, even the problem with property professionals, is that everyone is using a certain time cut to make their point valid. For example, if someone comes to you and says, have you seen this market? It's a poor performer. Over the last 5 years, it's done nothing. Or someone else who goes, I wouldn't invest in that city because the 10-year average is only 6%, where the 10-year average here is 8%. So the 5 becomes the 10 becomes the 15, or the 15 becomes the 1. You have to realize that in all angles, even including today's episode, time and performance can keep shifting together and not in equal ways. They eventually average out is the main thing because every single city has its time in the sun. So from that perspective, don't be too underwhelmed by a city based on the past, and don't be too excited by a city just because of the past either. The key is to know patterns and changes and understand long-term metrics of different markets across Australia. By uncovering certain long-term metrics today, you're going to realize that there are certain cities which aren't as bad as you thought they would be simply because of that time period that you know it most for. So a perfect example is even on the good sides. If we take Sydney and Melbourne, ever since 2012, which is about 13 years ago, the memory of most Australians today is that Sydney is the growth superstar market of Australia, or Melbourne is the growth superstar market of Australia. But since 2017, they haven't been anywhere near the best performers in Australia, which means it's now coming to 8 years of these markets being pretty average, going through zigzags, and going through periods of weakness. And so now the same thing can be looked at from the past of other cities as well. So let's get into some of those markets. Firstly, I'm going to take you through the 10-year intervals at different times, because everyone seems to keep thinking of property markets as these 10 years. Doubling of markets in 10 years. What's that city done over the last 10 years? What do you reckon the 10 years, the best performer, the worst performer's been? And thinking that the last 10, or just this number 10, is this most special calculation that's always used everywhere by property professionals, or even barbecues and family members always seem to use this 10-year number. So hey, we'll give it back to everyone in the same format and keep it 10 years, and I'll show you different time periods. So the first one is 2004 to 2014. The top 3 markets may surprise you. When it comes to the top 3 performers in Australia, it was Greater Darwin as the number 1 performer in Australia for those 10 years. So little old Darwin, yes, beat Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, the list goes on. It was ranked number 1 for capital growth during that whole 10-year period. And it wasn't just a part of that 10 years, a very small part. It was actually one of the best performers from 2008 all the way to 14. So of a 10-year period, no one beat Darwin for 6 of the 10 years. Game changing. Now let's go to number 2. Number 2 was Perth. So Perth was the second best performer in the nation during that 10-year period. And then when it comes to number 3, it was Greater Melbourne. How interesting is that, right? If you just use today, some of those markets are nowhere to be seen over the last 10-year periods. For example, if we fast forward to 2014 to 2024, it's a completely different picture during those 10 years. In second and third place, it's basically a tie. It's Greater Adelaide for second place, and then just behind it is Sydney for that 10-year period. So it gets really, really close. But then very close behind Sydney, or equal, is Brisbane. So you can see Hobart, Brisbane, Adelaide with the next choice. So if you took that same knowledge in 4 to 14 and assumed that past growth equals future growth in the way that everyone thinks it is, you would have gone to 2014 and loaded up all your money into Darwin. You would have become the mayor of Darwin probably, or one of the largest shareholders if you decide to do that as a Sydney-sider. But the main thing is, in 2014, that would have been the worst decision you could have made, right? And the same thing seems to be the case here. Now, it's not as simple as saying, based on that, you're now making the worst decision ever by buying in Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, or Hobart. It just means that growth doesn't work in the way you constantly think it does. So the thing is, past performance to future performance isn't this carry-on of perfect trends in either direction, bad becoming bad or good becoming better. It can take both parts of it. The main thing here is that you need to constantly look at the pressure, the demand signals of each of the cities and the greater cycle together to make a decision for what's looking likely to perform well moving forward. Let's go to give you another 10-year interval that isn't this perfect 04 to 14 or 14 to 24. And that's going to be a random selection here at 2009 to 19, because this doesn't consider that post-COVID boom. And again, this is something different. So in first place, you have Sydney by a mile. So much better performance in comparison. In second place, you have Melbourne. And then in third place, because there's that partial period of that late 19s or 15 to 19 involved in this 10-year period, Hobart comes roaring back into the equation with an ACT just around the corner. The main thing here is you can see in 3 different 10-year intervals, 04 to 14, Darwin and Perth, the 2 best. Then it's 09 to 19, Sydney and Melbourne, the 2 best. And then 14 to 24, you see Hobart, Sydney, Adelaide and Brisbane. But in terms of the top 2, it's Hobart and Adelaide in the best. So you can see every market is having a different cycle period, a different opportunity to boom, and there is money to be made all across Australia. There is wealth to grow all across Australia, and there is moments of markets becoming very affordable too all across Australia. For example, in the opposite is Darwin today. What was seen as an unaffordable huge boom in that first decade is now actually 10 plus years of very low performance. Prices are just now reaching their 2014 prices from 2025. So that's massive. It means 11 years of price change have led it back to whatever it was before in 2014. So it just shows you that periods of huge booms can also be met with long periods of weak growth and improving in affordability. Now, we've used capital cities for referencing. I actually want to take you through regional centers as well, because this is important. You're going to see regional centers labeled incorrectly by many, and it's usually just a poor amount of education or a lack of education on those markets. And that's okay. But people, instead of admitting that, will often find themselves championing their city because of the money it's made them during a certain window, or championing that city just based on recent performance, which is the wrong way to look at things. And so let's go through some markets where people may think that they aren't performers, or may think that there's no growth in these cities, or think that they've done poorly and there's no way they're going to perform. Looking at that, we'll take 2010 to 2020 in the city of Townsville. It actually declined by 13%. But if you take 2020 to 25, Townsville's grown 68% during those 5 years, clearly reshaping what that city's 10-year average is. And every year you give it, that 10-year average is substantially improving. So it just shows you that if someone looks at this market in 5 years from now, you're going to see 10-year averages that are almost mirroring the likes of Sydney, Newcastle, Brisbane, Melbourne, just to name a few. So it just shows you cities can go through periods and completely turn things around, which is why you can't constantly label a city a good city or a bad city the same way forever. If I give you another regional example, let's take the city of Bundaberg between 2010 and 2025. Between 2010 and 2020, Bundaberg had no house price growth. And then between 2020 to 2025, Bundaberg's grown 100%. Now, some people might say Bundaberg's become completely unaffordable, but they only look at that in that 5-year window of how much it's grown by 100%. It's grown 6.66% per annum over those 15 years if you just equally divide that 100 into 15. That is massive. What that shows you is long-term averages across Australia that range between 5 to 7%. Bundaberg has achieved that. But what it also shows you, it isn't going to some level of unaffordability or a price point that, shouldn't be growing based on what the country's been doing, or a price point that's unsustainable or shouldn't be growing, because the thing is, it's just making up for those 10 years it didn't grow. 6.66 per annum equally spread across 15 years, would someone complain about it then or say that it's not a good buy then? They wouldn't, but they tend to say that when it happens in 5 years to say that it's cooked, it's gone, and it can't happen again. People are often making this mistake. In year 2 of a boom, they say, that's unsustainable. There's no way it could grow 40% and do that again. Then in year 3 of the boom, year 4, year 5, until eventually that broken clock eventually is right. The main thing here is that many people get it wrong as well by thinking that this 100% of growth when it happened in year 1 of 20 or year 2 of 30 or 40 is unsustainable. It's not really unsustainable if it's catching up long periods of poor performance. It's been seen across Perth, it's been seen across Adelaide and Brisbane in recent times, and it's now being seen across our regional markets like Townsville, Rockhampton, Gladstone, and Bundaberg, to name a few in Queensland. Perth is a market I mentioned before from a capital front, and you can see it's doing the same thing over that 15 years. But what's really interesting is it's another reason to show you that another myth that many people believe is capital cities versus regional centres. Townsville's done just as well as Perth over the 15 years, if not slightly better, and then Bundaberg's done better than Perth over the last 15 years. So just showcases many cities, capital or regional, is another myth that we're busting while going through this. Don't have to be labeled that way for performance. The capital and capital city doesn't stand for capital growth. So the main thing here is these markets are just examples to show you can't look at past growth the way that you normally do. So those are giving you some 10-year windows and even extending into 15-year windows and showing you that markets in that way cannot be looked at, being that past growth bad equals now bad performance forever, or even if you flip it now is the next thing I want to go to, meaning that past growth bad equals now suddenly booming. It's not this magic 10-year number that you can keep flipping left and right and think that just copy paste where it hasn't performed over 10 years equals the next good 10 years. It's not that simple. A great example of that is Darwin. Between 2012, the prices of Darwin were just over 500k in the median, and by 2016, they'd reached just over 550. That's 10% in 4 years. Nothing great. Now you'd think that this period of low performance would eventually end, and from 2016 to 2022, it only grew 5%. And then from 2022 to 2025, it went down 3%. So you're basically having very little performance for now 13 years since this chart first started. Now you're having very low performance for almost 15 years of this city. That shows you that it's not this perfect, easy rule that you can take the last 10 years of low growth and immediately say the next is going to be high. There has to be changes in the micro performance as well of that city. Another example can also be seen in Brisbane. If you take Brisbane from 2011 to 2025, it has some interesting intervals of growth. Between 2011 to 2017, Brisbane only grew 15%. And then from 2017 to 2020, it only grew 5%. That means over that 7-year period, someone may have been looking closely at Brisbane and thinking, oh, it's 2017 now, surely it's going to perform really well again. It took another 3 years to even start the cycle, and it had 5% growth over a whole other 3 years. Is that really performance? It's not. So from 2011 all the way to 2020, that whole decade underperformed, and you can make the mistake of in between the decade thinking it's over, but then it goes on for longer with the underperformance. So that's another thing. Just because it's been 6 or 7 or 8 years, don't think it's suddenly about to end again and start booming again. That doesn't work that way. It has to have structural change in the market for it to change. So that's the different cycles of the 10 years being bad and not necessarily booming immediately, or 10 years being bad and then it does boom. But the main thing is it's not as simple as taking that number of 10 and thinking it's a great market or a bad market in that way. It does show, though, that past performance in the way up cannot be this thought that it continues and forever is to go the way up. So don't discount cities across the country. This next chart I'm going to show you is by far my favorite and the most interesting in real estate when it comes to the cities. What we did here is something that should completely blow your mind in real estate investing. We grabbed SA3s all across the country, which are essentially large clusters of suburbs put together to form a cleaner area of data. And we looked at these charts across 5 years, 10 years, and the last 20 years. And this is mind-blowing. Everyone seems to think that their city is the hot shot. Over the 5 years, that's the case. You see all these dots here that represent which areas and also represent which cities. Now, there is over 300 dots here on this because that's how many SA3s there are across Australia. But with these SA3s, what we're saying here is that you can see some dots going up to 16, 18%, which means 18% annual growth for 5 years. And you see some dots that are minus 2%, which is minus 2% annual growth for the 5-year period. But it's showing a scatter. It's really broad, which means that different markets, different places could have resulted in different performance. And over that 5 years, you can also see, because of that post-COVID boom, a lot of it is above that 6%, meaning very few dots or SA3s were under 6% capital growth in that selected 5-year period in terms of 6% per annum. Now you take it to 10 years. Check this out. At the 10-year mark, they start to tighten, which means there are less superstars and less worse performers. Together though, they start also becoming closer to that 6 to 7 or 5 to 7% annual average. And this is between 2015 to 25, because you're taking a longer horizon. Sure, there's some that have blown the lights out with a 10% per annum performance, but then there are also others which have gone to -1 or -2% for a whole 10-year window. So that's the spread is far less, as you can see. Instead of +17 and -2, it's the best is a +10 and a -1.5. So it's getting tighter. But also check out where all the dots are. They're all right in between. Now, if you're on Spotify or Apple listening to this and you're like, what's Arjun looking at? What dots is he talking about? Well, jump onto our YouTube page, check it out. It's InvestorKit. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because more content like this is coming your way. Third and final chart, this is the game changer. Check out the 20 years. Over the 20 years, all the dots are extremely tight, which means markets are performing extremely similarly over 20 years. And the gap now is 2% as the worst performer, and then 8% is the best. So there isn't anywhere going backwards completely. Obviously, when you include inflation, yes, but it's very small. There's 1 or 2 dots at most that are below that 5 or 6. The majority of the dots, though, sit at between 5 to 6.5% per annum over 20 years. So that city you think is a hotshot, or you think you're a great investment philosopher, researcher, found the secret hotspot, or the quote-unquote the media loves the next Byron Bay, well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. Over 20 years, we all get similar results. So what does that mean for you as an investor? I've got 3 final closing points you should consider. The first is, don't put your area up on a pedestal, or don't make your area that you're looking at or someone else is telling you about seem like the worst area ever. Things average out, and you got to not think that what you've got going on special or bad is going to last forever. Off the back of that, number 2 is, when you're looking at track record, don't think the past being great equals the future being great. It's not that simple. And don't think that just because a few years of the past being bad equals a new boom immediately. You need to look at the greater details of data. And then number 3, based on the 20 years of history in Australia, even if you extend it to 25 and 30, the dots stay very close, meaning you can expect a 5 to 7% long-term average if the things that played out over the last 20 years continue to play out over the next 20. And if that's the case, you should use that 5% minimum long-term average to be your worst case assumption of how you look at your portfolio. And you should be as diverse as possible across the country to allow you to maximize the chances of that happening. Because if you're in different parts of the country, and we can see how spread the 5-year bubble is, it means you can experience different growth rates at different times. And then eventually, because you've got a well-diverse portfolio and you've held it for a long period, being that if you're in the 40s or younger, you're going to hold it to retirement age from residential investing, you're in a position to get solid long-term growth should the past continue to be the future in this way. So that's my tips here from investing, is that you don't want to look at the past in that way. And anyone telling you their opinion of, hey, this city's rubbish, or that city's horrible, or that place is a place where you don't want to invest in, don't just assume that that past growth figure is the reason why. Look deeper into it and start realizing that across the country, every market has its time in the sun. That's it from me at InvestorKit. And if you like this episode, again, jump on, like, subscribe, and then drop me a comment of any other videos you'd like to hear about. Or if you're tuning in from Spotify or Apple, drop us a review and a rating. We'd love to hear from you.